At the beginning of the movie, we witness a girl in a state of panic rushing out of her house onto the road, evidently fleeing from something. She looks around fearfully, while her father peers out from the house, inquiring about her well-being. After assuring him that she's fine, she hurries back into the house to retrieve the car keys and drives off to the beach. Throughout her journey, her father persists in calling her, and upon finally answering the phone, she expresses her deep love for him and her mother, seeking forgiveness for her behavior. The following morning, the unfortunate discovery of the girl's mutilated body is made on the beach. Meanwhile, a student named Jay is relaxing in the pool near her house when her sister, Kelly, appears in the yard, informing her that their friends Paul and Yara have arrived and suggesting they watch a movie together. Jay declines, as she has plans for a date with a guy she recently met later that evening. Upon returning home later, Jay notices Yara reading The Idiot by Dostoevsky and learns that the book is about Paul. As Jay gets ready for her date, she meets a guy named Hugh in line for tickets at the theater. To pass the time, Jay proposes a game. Hugh must choose someone nearby whom he would like to be, and she has 2 attempts to guess and explain his choice. They soon enter the theater, and after failing both attempts, Jay asks whom Hugh had chosen. He indicates a little boy, reasoning that the child has no worries and his whole life ahead of him. In turn, Jay selects a person in the hall for Hugh to guess, but he mistakenly assumes she chose a girl in a yellow dress near the exit, though Jay denies seeing anyone there.
Are you teasing me? I'm sorry, I don't.
Suddenly, Hugh announces he's feeling ill and requests to return to the car. During the journey back from the theater, Hugh appears vigilant, prompting Jay's curiosity as she speculates whether he spotted someone he knew or an ex-girlfriend among the crowd. They subsequently head to a restaurant and spend the remainder of the evening in good spirits. The following day, Jay and Kelly embark on a walk near their house, with Kelly intending to sneak a cigarette away from their mother's watchful eye. Despite Jay's assurance that their mother is already aware of Kelly's habit, Kelly remains cautious about getting caught. During their stroll, Kelly inquires about Jay's date, prompting Jay to recount Hugh's peculiar behavior. On their way back home, they encounter their neighbor and Jay's classmate, Greg, who cheerfully waves as he washes his car. During their subsequent date, Jay and Hugh engage in intimacy within his car, following which he renders her unconscious with chloroform and transports her to the grounds of an abandoned factory. Upon regaining consciousness, Jay finds herself restrained in a wheelchair. Hugh offers apologies for his actions and implores her to listen attentively. He reveals that during their intimate encounter, he transferred to her a supernatural entity, which he had received in a similar manner from someone else before, and now it will relentlessly pursue her, manifesting as both familiar and unfamiliar individuals. Despite Jay's attempts to break free and call for assistance, Hugh persists in his narrative, elucidating that the entity can assume the guise of loved ones to inflict greater anguish. Suddenly, Hugh directs Jay's attention to a nude woman nearby, emphasizing that the entity has appeared. He then asserts that Jay can rid herself of the entity by engaging in intimate relations with another person promptly, thereby passing it on.
If it kills you, it'll come after me. Do you understand?
The naked woman approaches Jay, prompting Hugh to swiftly drive her away, cautioning her to steer clear of locations lacking escape routes, as outsmarting the entity proves futile. Meanwhile, Kelly, Paul, and Yara indulge in a card game drinking on the porch, with Kelly informing them of Jay's date with another guy. Shortly thereafter, Hugh arrives at the house, extracting Jay, who is scantily clad, from the car, and stresses the utmost importance of preventing the entity from making physical contact with her. Subsequently, Hugh departs, leaving Jay's sister and friends bewildered as they attempt to unravel the situation. Later, their neighbor Greg observes the arrival of an ambulance and police from his house window. An officer queries Jay about the nature of her connection with Hugh, to which she affirms consent. She also asserts unfamiliarity with the strange woman and denies ever visiting Hugh's residence, despite her awareness of his address. Jay is transported to the hospital for examination, while the police comb the scene, uncovering only Jay's purse and the abandoned wheelchair. The following day, Jay's and Greg's mothers deliberate over the events, lamenting the police's failure to apprehend Hugh, who rented the property under a false identity. Anxiously, Jay scrutinizes herself in the bathroom when suddenly, the girl nervously peers out the window, failing to notice the boy hiding below, before returning to her activities. Later, during a lecture, Jay suddenly spots a peculiar elderly woman dressed in white approaching a distant window. Observing Jay's distress, Greg notices her reaction and watches as she hastily gathers her belongings and flees the classroom. Jay traverses the hallway, her gaze darting around, until she spots the old woman standing in the middle of the corridor. Addressing the woman, Jay inquires about her identity, but the other students, standing at a distance, merely exchange surprised glances, as none except Jay can see the elderly figure. Filled with apprehension, Jay exits the building and makes her way to the diner where Kelly and Paul are employed. She recounts the unsettling encounter with the old woman and divulges Hugh's ominous warning about an entity haunting her. Paul queries what this entity could be, but Jay finds herself at a loss for an explanation. Concerned for her safety, Paul suggests she stay the night at their house. Later, in the night, Paul watches old movies in the living room while Kelly, Yara, and Jay retire to bed. Unable to sleep, Jay descends to the living room and confides in Paul. He proposes she rest on the couch beside him, reminiscing about childhood memories as they chat. Their conversation is abruptly interrupted by the sound of shattering glass from the kitchen. Paul investigates but finds no one there upon his return. Waking Kelly to summon the police, Paul accompanies Jay as she ventures into the kitchen to investigate further. To her horror, Jay encounters a partially unclothed woman approaching her. She screams in terror before bolting to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. Knocks on the door from Kelly and Paul prompt Jay to eventually unlock it, fearing the entity has infiltrated the house. Kelly and Paul attempt to reassure Jay, but their efforts are interrupted by a knock at the door. Initially presuming it to be their mother, they are surprised when Yara responds from the corridor. As Paul and Kelly cautiously open the door, a man suddenly emerges behind Yara. In a state of horror, Jay bolts out of the house, leaping through the balcony, seizing a nearby bike, and speeds away. Greg, accompanied by his girlfriend in the car, witnesses this abrupt departure. Shortly after, Jay arrives at the park and settles on a swing, anxiously scanning her surroundings. Abruptly, she detects movement among the trees, only to realize it's Kelly and her friends. Upon meeting them, Jay implores Kelly to keep the ordeal secret from their mother, convinced she wouldn't believe it anyway. Suddenly, Jay spots another figure in the distance and queries if the others see it too. After confirming the person's existence, she identifies Greg. Paul discloses that there was a break-in at Jay's house, prompting Greg to suggest involving the police. However, Jay expresses fear of returning home and insists on finding Hugh. Curious about Hugh's actions, Greg inquires about his involvement, but Jay remains silent. Consequently, Greg proposes they search for Hugh in his car. Early the next morning, the friends find themselves in a rundown neighborhood and eventually locate the purported house of Hugh. Upon inspection, they realize the residence has been vacant for a considerable duration. Amidst the discovery, Paul stumbles upon a collection of erotic magazines, wherein he uncovers a photo of Hugh with a classmate. Summoning Jay, who had noticed a stranger in the window and contemplated fleeing, Paul reveals the photo. Recognizing the school emblem on the classmate's jacket, the friends decide to investigate further at the school to glean insights into Hugh's identity. At the school, they uncover that Hugh's real name is Jeff before returning to the car. Despite Kelly's suggestion of involving the authorities, Jay adamantly refuses. Subsequently, they reach Jeff's actual residence. Jay knocks on the door, and Jeff's mother welcomes them inside. In the backyard, they encounter Jeff, who elucidates that he can still perceive the entity because if it ensnares Jay, it will revert to him and propagate down the chain. Jeff also wonders why Jay hasn't transmitted the entity by engaging in intimate relations with another, apologizing as he explains he felt compelled with no alternative.
Wherever you are, it's somewhere, walking straight for you.
Jeff also mentions that this entity moves slowly, allowing them time to drive far away and deliberate on whether to pass it on to someone else. Following Jeff's suggestion, Greg leads them to the lake house where he spent childhood summers with his father. They spend the next day on the road, with Kelly expressing gratitude to Greg for his assistance and inquiring about his mother's concern, to which Greg assures she won't even notice his absence. Upon arrival at the lake house, the friends retire for the night after a taxing day. The following morning, Greg takes it upon himself to teach Jay how to handle a revolver. Subsequently, they unwind on the beach, except for Yara, who remains in the water. Suddenly, the entity assumes the guise of Yara and ambushes Jay from behind, seizing her by the hair. Paul attempts to fend off the invisible assailant with a chair, but it forcefully hurls him aside. As the friends flee, the entity, resembling Yara, continues to pursue Jay. Taking refuge in the shed, Paul, Kelly, and Jay arm themselves with the revolver. Jay opens fire at the entity, eventually landing a shot to its head. However, the entity perseveres, advancing toward the shed. Despite their efforts to barricade the door, it relentlessly attempts to breach their sanctuary, shattering a portion of the door in the process. Meanwhile, Greg, who had momentarily stepped away, returns to find the others in distress. Unaware of the invisible threat, he peers through a gap in the door, failing to comprehend their fear. Jay insists there is indeed something outside, prompting Greg to investigate around the shed, when suddenly, the entity, now resembling a boy, advances directly toward Jay, prompting her to panic and flee the shed through an alternate exit. Leaping into the car, she speeds away, while the entity morphs into an unfamiliar girl and gives chase. Despite the friends' futile attempts to halt her, Jay's erratic driving leads to a collision in a cornfield when a truck unexpectedly appears on the road. After some time, Jay regains consciousness in the hospital, nursing a head injury and a broken arm. She observes her sleeping friends, sister, and mother in the room. Moments later, she hears approaching footsteps, but it turns out to be a passing nurse. During the night, Greg remains by her side in the room, Despite his disbelief in the existence of the malevolent entity, he decides to make love to her. 3 days later, Greg visits Jay in the hospital and reports that he hasn't encountered any entities during this period. Although Jay is upset by his initial skepticism, Greg attempts to reassure her that he believes her, emphasizing that he hasn't experienced any paranormal occurrences. As they converse, Paul watches from the corridor, evidently jealous of Greg's attention to Jay. Upon Jay's return home, she resumes swimming in the pool but remains plagued by the sensation of being watched. Meanwhile, Greg approaches Jay's house to visit her, only to learn from Kelly and their friends that she has locked herself in her room out of fear. They inquire if Greg genuinely observed nothing unusual, considering Jay's genuine distress, but realize he still harbors doubts. As night falls, Jay peers through her window at Greg's house and is startled to witness him clad in a white nightgown, heading towards his residence. She becomes increasingly alarmed as she observes him futilely attempting to enter through the door before resorting to breaking a window to gain entry. In a frantic attempt to warn the real Greg of the impending danger, Jay tries to call him, but receives no response. Determined to intervene, she rushes to his house, only to encounter the entity masquerading as Greg's mother at his room's entrance. Despite her desperate screams, Greg disregards her warnings and allows the entity to enter the room. Shocked and horrified, Jay witnesses the entity violate the lifeless body of Greg before fleeing the house and taking refuge in her car, pursued once again by the entity, now assuming the guise of Greg. Driving away from the house, Jay spends the night in the woods, eventually falling asleep in the car. The next morning, she ventures out to the beach, where she encounters 3 guys on a boat. After disrobing, she wades into the water. Later that day, Jay returns home to find Kelly and Yara waiting for her on the porch. They all retire to Jay's room and eventually drift off to sleep together. In due course, Paul knocks on the door. Jay opens it and warns him that the entity will inevitably return. Paul, driven by his love for Jay, offers to take the entity from her and questions why she chose Greg. Jay declines his offer, unwilling to endanger Paul, and explains that she believed everything would be fine with Greg because he showed no fear, and they had previously been intimate. Despite Jay's rejection, Paul attempts to kiss her and reiterates his desire to assist her. Jay rebuffs his advances and expresses her lack of trust, prompting Paul to reminisce about the place where they shared their first kiss, the pool. Intrigued, they, along with Kelly and Yara, embark on a journey to the pool. However, as they drive away, Jay notices the entity perched on the roof of her house in the form of an unfamiliar naked man. Later, the friends arrive at a remote location, carrying suitcases, and proceed to traverse a fence, making their way toward a sprawling structure. Within the building, they navigate a technical corridor until they reach the pool area. Unpacking the suitcases, they retrieve various electronic devices, arranging them around the pool's perimeter and connecting them to the power grid in a bid to lure the entity into the water and administer a fatal electric shock. As they await the entity's arrival, Jay decides to take a swim, coinciding with the onset of a storm outside. After several hours, the entity materializes at the pool. Kelly inquires about the entity's appearance, but Jay remains evasive, disclosing only that it manifested in the form of their father. However, instead of pursuing Jay into the pool, the entity begins hurling the electronic devices into the water. Fortunately, Jay survives the failed electric shock attempt, but the entity prevents her from leaving the pool, striking her with a powerful blow to the head using one of the devices. In a desperate attempt to fend off the invisible assailant, Paul shoots at the entity with a revolver, accidentally injuring Yara in the process. Kelly intervenes, managing to cover the entity with a towel, rendering it visible to Paul, who promptly shoots it in the head. The entity collapses into the water, but as Jay attempts to exit the pool, it ensnares her leg and drags her underwater once again. Paul fires another shot randomly, striking the entity once more in the head. Terrified, Jay extricates herself from the pool, noticing a mark on her leg from the entity's grip. Approaching the water once more, she observes it turning red. Upon returning home, Jay decides to sleep with Paul. Later, he inquires if she feels any different, to which Jay responds in the negative. Paul echoes her sentiment, claiming he doesn't feel anything either. Shortly after, Paul drives through a rough neighborhood and notices 2 prostitutes by the roadside. It appears he contemplates passing the entity to one of them. In the movie's conclusion, Jay and Paul stroll down the street hand in hand, with the silhouette of an individual visible in the distance. Do you think the heroes will be able to get rid of the entity? And where do you think this could have come from? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.